Professor Sapir, there's been a growing number of free trade agreements in the world, more than 270. But increasingly these free trade agreements that lower tariffs include other issues such as regulatory issues or dispute settle mechanisms. Is that the reason why many constituencies, especially in developed countries, oppose new free trade agreements?
That's the way I see it, indeed. I think that's a very important point that you make. It's not just an increase in the number of agreements, it's an increase in the scope of those agreements. I wrote a paper in 2010 with two colleagues called Beyond the WTO ? And we looked at US free trade area agreements and EU free trade agreements with third parties. We looked at the content and we wanted to look into the details. You know, what are those agreements about? Are they about going deeper into areas that are already covered by the WTO, what we call WTO plus? Or are they going into new areas that are not yet covered by the WTO agreements, which we call WTO extra? And what we did find is that indeed, especially the newer agreements, and even those, we did this study in 2010, but there have been many more agreements since then, we see that the recent agreements, they are a lot, obviously always on WTO plus, they are deeper, they are removing tariffs and they are doing what the WTO is doing but going further, but they are also opening new areas. And as far as the EU and the US is concerned, it's always the same kind of areas. It's about competition policy, it's about investment, it's about labor and environmental policies, and one or two other, usually capital movement. So all of them essentially about regulatory matters. And I think indeed part of the backlash is about these new issues. Some people, and not just sort of protectionists, I mean, that there is a backlash against free trade agreement for, let's say, protectionist reason, people trying to protect their sectors and not wanting to have greater competition. I think that's something that one could expect, and it's there. Part of the backlash is due to that. But I think there is also a new constituency, in a sense, that is opposed to those agreements because of their new scope, because of their regulatory scope, not feeling very comfortable with agreements that they feel, those opponents, is limiting the scope of government to regulate at the national level. Our free trade agreements that cover some of those regulatory matters mean that the country will have less room to decide on regulation because it has taken commitment with a foreign partner. And what is interesting in Europe is that as long as we were doing agreements with smaller countries, including some of the Latin American countries, it did not raise any discussion in Europe. Why? Because we essentially impose all regulation on the partner. We, in Europe, we are big enough to tell the partner, look, we have very advanced type of regulation. We also have a big market. If you want to trade with us and to trade more freely with us, then you will need to accept some of our regulation. That did not cause any problem. No citizen was opposed to that. The opposition has come now more recently in the discussion with the US, the TTIP, because there we are more or less of equal size. The EU and the US have economies roughly with the same GDP. We are both regulatory powers. We are regulatory rule makers, not rule takers. And so here a discussion between two rule makers, is much more difficult. We know we are not going to impose to the US our rules, but the US is also not going to impose our rules. And there is a fear in Europe by some that maybe although we are big like the US, maybe we are weaker politically than the US, and therefore the US will impose some of its rules. And what you hear in Europe, people fearing that our environmental standards or social standards will be lowered through those agreements. That's the kind of fear that you have. So it's a very new phenomenon, new backlash that did not exist in earlier agreements, although they covered already some of those issues, because the counterparts, the countries that we were making the agreement with, were smaller, and therefore we could impose our rules. We did not fear that others were going to impose their rules on us.
Professor Sapir, the world was shocked with the UK referendum on Brexit or Remain. What are the main implications for European integration after that result?
Well, I can say I was shocked too, and I think all of Europe, not just the world at large, was shocked. It is a major development. It is indeed the first time that a country is leaving the European Union. Countries so far have been knocking on the door to enter into the European Union. So, it's something that we are just not ready even to digest. Now, what are the consequences? I think the main consequences will be for the UK, but on the side of Europe, it means also we need to rethink a number of things. I think partly the UK is leaving because the UK maybe was never much at ease with the European project. The European project is a political project, and I think the UK has been seeking more of an economic relationship. And the more we went into deep integration, the less the UK felt comfortable, and that's why the UK was not a part and is not a part of the common currency. That's why the UK is not part of the migration area that we have with Schengen. So the UK has tried to remain on the more economic. But it's clear that the more the other countries integrated, the more the UK found itself a little bit on the margin of the system. And so you can say, well, maybe for the process is not so bad. It's a country that was already marginal that is now taking a step out. Another way to look at it is that it's a country that felt unhappy with a number of elements, and it's true that we have had a difficult crisis or series of crises, the euro crisis, slow growth, the migration issue, the refugee problem. So all of those have shown that Europe has difficulties to solve some of its problems, and one has heard in other countries the same kind of unhappiness that one has heard in the UK, and I think it's certainly an issue that we need to address. We can't sort of just say, well, it's just the UK leaving, and the UK was never at ease with us. They are leaving, and we should not take notice of it. So I think it goes a bit both ways. Partly, the UK is a special country. On the other hand, it's also that there are certainly weaknesses in the process of European integration that needs to be addressed. Now, one of the issues now, looking forward, assuming that the UK is actually leaving, that we need to deal with is what kind of relationship with the UK? What kind of relationship for the UK with the rest of Europe? The geography, the history has not changed because of Brexit. The UK is still a country in Europe, not in the EU, but it is a neighbor, an immediate neighbor. The history is also of close relationship, and those relationships, they will need to continue. And they're not just about economic relationship also, they are probably problems of defense, of security. We live in a tough region. We have tough neighbors, Russia, Turkey, the Middle East in general. So we're in a much more dangerous kind of zone and era than we were before. And the UK has much to contribute to that. So I think there are issues that we need to deal with, and we don't know yet how to deal with that. So it's going to be, in a sense, a distraction. It's going to take a lot of resources, political resources, to deal with this fundamental problem. And hopefully we are going to find solutions that are agreeable to both sides. They can be a very nasty negotiation, could be, that will be, in a sense, a bit destructive to the two sides. We can do harm to the UK. We are big, and we can do harm to them by not offering them, very easy access, and they can be nasty to us. And I think that would be very detrimental. Or we can try to be grown-ups and accept that, okay, there's a member of the family leaving. Nonetheless, we have children in common, and we need to take care of certain common issues. So let's see how it works, but it's putting a set of important questions that we need to address, and they won't be easy. We were not prepared for that. Nobody was prepared for that. And the UK was not prepared itself.
Global Trade Alert, Professor Sapir, has shown an increased number of protectionist measures in its last report since the Great Recession. But is protectionism really on the rise?
Well, I think the Global Trade Alert has really done a great job. It's clear that the Great Recession was going to lead to some protectionist measures. And I think it was good that right from the start there was monitoring. And I think that monitoring has helped to also subdue the process. Now, has there been really an increase of protection? Depends a bit what you mean by protectionism. Has there been an increase of violations of commitments made in the WTO? I don't think that much. Has there been an increase of measures that have protectionist intent but that are not covered by the WTO? The answer is probably yes. So it depends the way you look at this. You can say, yes, there is an increase of protectionism, or no, there's not that much of an increase. To me, what is very, very important here is that commitments that countries have made to the WTO have been upheld on the whole. That in that sense, countries have not resorted to measures that they had promised they would not. But yes, at the same time, they did use other possibilities to try to help their own industry.